On the 21st December 1971, a hospital in Kirkuk, Iraq, admitted a patient suffering from a series of strange symptoms. They were experiencing numbness in their hands and feet, darkness at the edges of their vision, unsteadiness, and trembling. The patient's symptoms were worsening, and they were not alone. Over the next few days, dozens more people suffering from the same strange symptoms were admitted to hospital. It became clear that this was not an isolated case, but something much more sinister, an epidemic, or perhaps a mass poisoning. Within weeks, more than 400 people would be dead, and thousands permanently injured, as authorities appeared still uncertain about the cause. The 1960s was a tough decade for many Iraqi citizens. Political and economic instability had combined with a series of droughts to create a serious food shortage, which was particularly severe in remote parts of the country. Indeed, the situation was so dire that farmers had resorted to eating grain they had purchased for planting just to keep themselves and their families alive. This, of course, only contributed to future poor harvests. To remedy this problem, the government of Iraq looked to import a large quantity of grain for planting, in the hope that a bountiful harvest would set the country on the road to better food security. After some negotiation, the government were able to strike what seemed like an excellent deal with an American firm, Cargill Company. It was a big deal, so big, in fact, that Cargill sent a representative to visit Iraq personally to offer their thanks to the government. In total, 73 million kilograms, or 73,000 tons, of wheat grain and 22 million kilograms, or 22,000 tons, of barley would be shipped to Iraq. The grain from the US and the barley from a facility in Mexico. The Iraqi buyers foresaw one problem. These vital grains were prone to developing mold during transit. To prevent the nightmare scenario where the product arrived spoiled, they insisted that a fungicide be used. The fungicide they decided on was methyl mercury. Coating grain with methyl mercury is a cheap and effective way of protecting the grain from mold, and also ensures that the grain will not sprout before it's planted. Mercury compounds are, however, extremely hazardous to human health, and as such, mercury-coated grains cannot be eaten, although the grain they produce when planted is safe for human consumption. At the time, the dangers of methyl mercury were well known. In fact, there had been cases of poisoning in Iraq resulting from the use of mercury-coated grain twice before, in 1956 and 1960. In both cases, farmers had been given grain treated with mercury and warned not to consume it. However, they had proceeded to do so after thoroughly washing the grain, believing this would remove the harmful mercury coating. It had, of course, not done so, and in each case several people had died as a result. Since then, the dangers of distributing mercury-coated grain had been recognized, and steps had been taken to avoid repeat accidents. Now, in 1971, all mercury-coated grain would be distributed in clearly labelled sacks including warnings that the grain was only for planting, and bearing clear skull and crossbones markings to indicate that the contents were poisonous. Further to this, the grain itself would also be dyed an unnatural pink colour to differentiate it from edible grain and discourage its consumption. Thus it was that huge quantities of dyed and labelled grain sacks arrived on boats at the port city of Basra between September and November 1971. Over the course of the next few weeks, it was distributed by road, mostly to remote areas in northern Iraq. The grain came courtesy of the government, and so no payment from farmers was required. Distributors were, however, instructed to brief farmers that the grain could not be eaten and was only for planting. A signature or thumbprint to indicate that the farmers understood this should be obtained before the grain was handed over. This was where things began to go wrong. The planting season was almost over by the time the grain arrived, and so distribution was carried out with a degree of urgency. Thus, farmers were not always made to sign to show they had understood the dangers of the grain they were receiving. some farmers were not warned at all. Even among those who were warned, some disregarded the advice. They assumed that the consequences of consuming the grain would not be serious, or thought that they could simply wash the grain to remove the harmful fungicide. Some farmers fed the grain to their livestock, saw no immediate adverse reaction in their animals, and thus assumed the grain was safe for humans too, not realizing that the symptoms of mercury poisoning might take weeks to appear in some animals. The warnings on the sacks of grain were clear and unequivocal, but the text was in English or Spanish, languages that few Iraqi farmers could read. The skull and crossbones symbol that adorned many sacks was, in the West, widely understood to indicate poison, but in Iraq it carried no such connotations. These warnings went unheeded. The end result was that much of the grain, delivered too late in the season to really be planted, ended up being made into bread to be consumed by farmers and their families, or sold on to others. Bread was a staple food, and most people in remote areas consumed it with every meal. The pink dye, intended to indicate that the grain was not safe to consume, resulted in bread with a novel pink tinge, which made it particularly attractive to children. Still more of the grain was used to feed chicken, sheep, and cattle, which produced milk and eggs or were eventually consumed in turn. Within weeks, the first people suffering from mercury poisoning were admitted to hospital. They suffered from a loss of vision, sometimes amounting to sudden and complete blindness, as well as numbness in the extremities and a loss of motor control. Many also suffered from painful gastrointestinal symptoms and rapid renal failure. The number of affected patients increased steadily. As December went on, daily admissions rose into the hundreds, overwhelming some hospitals. This rash of serious symptoms didn't go unnoticed, and given the history of mercury poisoning accidents in Iraq, doctors were soon able to identify the cause. Questioning of patients even allowed them to identify the origin of the grain that had caused this outbreak of illness. Within days, doctors had alerted the Iraqi government to the problem, but it was weeks before any action was taken. Indeed, it was January 1972 before the government began issuing advice about the tainted grain, stating that it should not be consumed. As the number of deaths steadily increased, the advice changed, stating that farmers should destroy the grain and that there would be severe punishments for anyone found selling it, up to and including the death penalty. Alarmed, many farmers sought to dispose of the grain as quickly and covertly as possible, sometimes dumping it into rivers and irrigation ditches. This, however, led to further contamination of drinking water, or of fish and animals who lived in or drank from these water sources. It took until March 1972 to get the situation under control, and by that time 6,500 people had received hospital treatment, and 459 had died as a result of mercury poisoning. This was later noted to be a conservative estimate. Many more might have died in the home after being discharged from hospital or being taken home by relatives. There was a strong cultural preference to die at home with family rather than in a hospital, and many home deaths in remote areas were not reported. Thus, some estimates state that as many as 4,000 people might have actually died as a result of the poisoned grain. Consumption of the grain was fatal in around 1 in 5 cases, and around a third of those who died were children. In the aftermath of the Iraq poisoned grain disaster, a number of changes were made globally to the way in which grain is distributed. The Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization collaborated to recommend that dangerous products be labeled in the local language, using symbols that are understood in their intended destination. It was also recommended that any grain product with a poisonous fungicide not only be dyed, but also be treated with another additive to make it taste bitter and unappealing. By the mid-1970s, many countries around the world had stopped the use of mercury compounds as fungicides altogether. Other, less toxic products were now available, and the dangers of mercury were more widely recognised. The UK prohibited the use of methylmercury in 1971, the USA in 1970, and Iraq itself in the mid-1970s. Despite this ban, the damage caused by the 1971 Poison Grain disaster was extremely long-lasting. Many survivors suffered brain damage and other permanent neurological effects. The academic performance of affected schoolchildren was permanently impacted. Children born to affected parents had a higher incidence of birth defects, brain damage, and death in infancy, and the poisoning led to a huge rise in the rate of neurological conditions such as Parkinson's in the affected population. This disaster casts a long shadow over the country. The damage it has caused is generational, a mass human tragedy caused by rushed distribution and a failure of communication on an industrial scale.